So first of all, micturition means the ejection of urine. Now let's talk about the path of urine. Everyone knows that the urine forms in the nephron and the collecting duct collects it, and then it passes on to the renal pelvis in the medulla region of the kidney, and then from the renal pelvis it goes to the ureters. From there it goes to the urinary bladder and then eventually to the urethra. Now let's talk about what happens when the urine fills up the urinary bladder. When the urine fills up about 300 milliliters of the limit, we get a mild urge to pee. But when it fills 400 to 500 ml, that's when we get a strong urge. But if we do want to control it, the maximum limit is 800 ml. But basically, when the urine fills of about 400 to 500 milliliters, the stretch receptors in the walls of the urinary bladder get activated. And what follows is something called the reflex arc or the reflex path. So now, the reflex arc, as you all would know, would contain an effector muscle. The effectors, it's not a muscle, it could be anything. Effector, sensory neuron, motor neuron. Okay, so the reflex arc consists of an effector, the sensory neuron, the interneuron which connects the sensory and the motor neuron, the motor neuron, and then the effector. And in between, the interneuron passes the message to spinal cord and the CNS. This is the reflex arc, and since it includes this, that is why this entire thing is called the micturition reflex. The neural pathway that controls micturition is the micturition reflex. Now let us see how the reflex arc works in this case. The effectors in this case are the stretch receptors which get activated. They send the signal through the sensory neurons to the interneuron. Over here, through the interneuron to the spinal cord and then the central nervous system. Now you may ask, reflex arc should be controlled by spinal cord, so then why is the CNS involved? Of course, you do know that the message is later transferred to CNS, but in this particular reflex arc, our CNS has a higher control over it. It has a voluntary control over the reflex arc, and this is something that is unique to micturition reflex. So all you have to remember is that the CNS does have a voluntary control over this reflex arc. Now when the message is sent to the CNS knows, okay, the urinary bladder is filled for up to 400-500 milliliters and the stretch receptors are the ones who gave me the signal. Now, I can either choose to pee or I can either choose to hold it in. Now, it sends the message again to the interneuron here. The interneuron in turn sends it to the motor neuron, which sends it to the effector muscle. The effector muscle here is the tetracer muscle. It's an involuntary smooth muscle. Now, after it sends the signal to the tetracer muscle, let's see what happens. Now, the tetracer muscle, due to the signal, contracts, and that kind of increases the pressure and it allows the urine to come down. Now, along with contracting the tetracer muscle, it also relaxes the urethral sphincter. Here, US just means urethral sphincter. The urethral sphincter is over here, and it basically allows the urethral sphincter to relax and just open. It opens so that the urine can flow out. Now, after it does these two crucial things, the urine comes out. Now, let us see why urine analysis is of clinical significance. So, first of all, it can be the indicator to many diseases, and this is just one of the example. This is about diabetes mellitus. So, basically, glucosuria and ketonuria are two conditions, where glucosuria means excess glucose and ketonuria means excess ketone bodies. Now, NCERT only mentions up till here, but I'll go a step further and explain how this is exactly possible. Now, the excess glucose is due to, it could be of two reasons. It could be due to the reduction of insulin, like the pancreas just stopped producing insulin, or our autoimmune system is destroying the insulin, or our body has developed a resistance to the insulin. Now, the former two conditions are would cause type 1 diabetes mellitus, and the next condition would cause type 2 diabetes mellitus. So basically, whenever there is less insulin production or there is a resistance to insulin production, it stops the glucose from going into the cell, because it is the insulin in the first place that enables the glucose to reach the cells. Now, when the glucose doesn't go into the cells, it gets accumulated in the blood, and when it gets accumulated in the blood, you might remember it's the PCT's job to reabsorb glucose. But the PCT has a renal threshold limit for how much glucose it could actually reabsorb. So then the glucose remains in the filtrate and it remains in the urine, and that condition is called glucosuria, and using that we can determine that the person got diabetes mellitus. And there is also one more drawback. Whenever there is excess glucose in the filtrate, it also drags the water into the filtrate, so that could also lead to dehydration, and that is one of the symptoms of diabetes mellitus. And now when we talk about ketonuria, ketonuria means it is also directly related to diabetes mellitus, because whenever there is no glucose to the cells tend to starve. Now they naturally look for other sources of energy, and that other source of energy is basically fat. So then they decide to break down the fats. When they decide to break down the fats, it releases ketone bodies. Now, what's the problem if they release ketone bodies? Well, the problem is that they are very acidic and they can make the blood become acidic, and that shouldn't happen. So these two conditions are detected through the urine, and it could detect diabetes mellitus. Now, it could also indicate kidney malfunction. For example, you know that the glomerulus is responsible for ultrafiltration, and it's not supposed to allow large proteins into the filtrate. But when the glomerulus fails, it is a kidney malfunction, obviously. So when the glomerulus fails, it allows the proteins inside, and the proteins are visible in the urine that we excrete, and that condition is called proteinuria. So that indicates glomerulus damage. So that's another thing. And one more interesting fact which we all know about is that through checking the urine, we can also determine whether one is pregnant or not. So that is also important clinical significance of urine. And finally, we've got some interesting facts to remember. So an adult human on an average passes about 1 to 1.5 liters of urine per day, which includes 20 to 30 grams of urea. The pH of the urine is 6.0, and that's because it's actually 4.0 to 8.0 pH, and its average is taken to be 6. And also the urine has a characteristic odor. So now this is pretty much all that NCERT has included. So what we've learned from this is that what exactly is micturition, what is the micturition reflex. Micturition reflex is the neural mechanism that controls the micturition. Now the path of urine and the stretch receptors, how the stretch receptors get activated, send signal to the CNS through the sensory neurons, how the CNS in turn sends a signal to the detrusor muscle to contract, and as well as the urethral sphincter to relax for the passing out of the urine, and how urine could be of clinical significance by indicating diseases like diabetes mellitus and kidney malfunctions through these two conditions called glucosuria and ketonuria, and also some interesting facts about how much urine we excrete per day, how much urea, what's the pH of urine, and also its characteristic odor. Thank you.